I'm Abigail Harper, 35, and there are moments in life that change everything. Mine came last spring when my daughter's desperate call interrupted the perfect family dinner my mother insisted on having. "Mom, it's starting. Please come now." Emma's voice trembled through my phone while my mother sighed across our marble dining table. "We're having a luxury dinner as a family, Abigail." What happened next would shatter our family's carefully maintained facade and force me to finally stand up for what truly matters. Before I continue, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and hit subscribe to join us for more real stories. Growing up in the Harper household meant one thing above all else: appearances matter. My mother, Margaret, was the undisputed queen of our upper-middle-class neighborhood in Connecticut, known for her impeccable taste, perfect dinner parties, and razor-sharp judgments about those who didn't meet her standards. Unfortunately, that often included me. From my earliest memories, I was taught the importance of presenting the right image. My childhood bedroom was pristine, decorated in tasteful pastels that my mother selected, not the vibrant colors I begged for. My clothes were always pressed, my hair always neatly styled, and my grades were expected to be perfect. When I brought home an A- in 7th grade math, my mother didn't speak to me for 3 days. "Harpers don't settle for second best, Abigail," she would say, her voice quiet but sharp as a knife. "People are always watching, judging. We must be beyond reproach." Our home reflected Margaret's obsession with status, a sprawling colonial with manicured gardens, and a grand entrance that intimidated my school friends so much that eventually they stopped coming over. Inside was no less imposing, with crystal chandeliers, antique furniture too delicate to actually use, and my mother's prized collection of silver serving pieces that required hours of polishing. While other families went camping or to the beach for vacation, we attended charity galas and country club functions where I was paraded around like a show pony. "This is my daughter Abigail," my mother would say, her hand firmly gripping my shoulder. "She's first in her class and just started learning the cello." The pressure to live up to her introductions was crushing. My father, William, a successful investment banker, enabled my mother's fixation on status by providing the financial means while remaining emotionally distant. He retreated to his study each evening after dinner, content to let Margaret rule the household as long as everything appeared perfect from the outside. At 18, I saw marriage as my escape route. James was charming, ambitious, and most importantly lived 2 states away. My mother approved because his family had the right connections, and he was headed to law school. What she didn't know, what none of us knew, was that James had a carefully hidden dark side. The abuse started subtly criticism that mirrored my mother's isolation from my college friends, controlling my spending. By our 3rd anniversary, it had escalated to shoving, and eventually a push down the stairs that left me with a broken wrist and the courage to finally leave when I discovered I was pregnant. With nowhere else to go, I returned home to my parents with my tail between my legs, pregnant and divorced at 23. To my surprise, my mother didn't say, "I told you so." Instead, she saw my unborn child as a new project, another chance to create perfection. We'll say the marriage ended amicably. She decided, planning my narrative like a public relations expert. No one needs to know the unpleasant details. When Emma was born, she became my reason for everything. She had my dark curly hair and her father's blue eyes, but a spirit entirely her own. Curious, creative, and with a stubborn streak that both terrified and delighted me. I wanted to protect her from experiencing the same pressures I had faced, but living under my parents' roof made that nearly impossible. Margaret took her role as grandmother seriously, showering Emma with expensive clothes and enrolling her in the right preschool, then the right private elementary school, and signing her up for piano lessons, tennis, and ballet. But Emma had her own ideas. From the time she could hold a crayon, my daughter was drawn to art, covering any available surface with vibrant, chaotic creations that made my mother wince. "It's just a phase," Margaret would say, dismissively removing Emma's drawings from the refrigerator and replacing them with her report cards. "She needs proper activities that will get her into a good college." I found work as an administrative assistant at a local insurance firm, but my salary barely covered Emma's school expenses, and certainly wasn't enough for us to move out. Year after year, I told myself it was temporary, that soon we'd have our own place. But my mother's constant reminders of my financial limitations kept me trapped in a cycle of dependency and gratitude. "Do you know what tuition costs these days?" she would ask whenever I suggested finding an apartment. "You're lucky your father and I can provide Emma with opportunities you couldn't give her on your own." She was right, of course. My divorce had left me with nothing, and James fought tooth and nail against paying child support until finally disappearing to take a job in Singapore when Emma was 5. After that, he sent occasional birthday cards, but nothing else. As Emma entered adolescence, her artistic talents blossomed. Her art teacher, Ms. Reynolds, took a special interest in her work, encouraging her to develop her unique style and enter competitions. To my delight and my mother's dismay, Emma won several local awards. "Art is a hobby, not a career," my mother would say at dinner, passing the perfectly roasted potatoes. "You need something practical to fall back on." Emma would look to me, waiting for me to defend her, and I would say something noncommittal like, "There's plenty of time to decide about college majors," never directly contradicting my mother, but not fully supporting my daughter either. Each time I saw disappointment flash in Emma's eyes, and each time I hated myself a little more for my cowardice. When Emma started her sophomore year of high school, Ms. Reynolds selected her as one of few students to participate in the Regional Young Artists Showcase, a prestigious event that could lead to scholarship opportunities and recognition from art schools across the country. Emma was ecstatic, working on her submission for months, a series of paintings exploring identity and belonging that even I could see were remarkable. The showcase was scheduled for April 15th, a date that made my stomach sink when I saw it on the calendar. April 15th was the night of my mother's annual charity gala for the hospital board, an event she had chaired for the past decade and considered the crown jewel of her social calendar. "You'll both attend the gala, of course," she said when I tentatively mentioned Emma's showcase. "Emma needs to start networking with the right people. The hospital board members include university trustees who could write recommendation letters." "But Mom, this showcase is really important for Emma's artistic development," I tried to explain. "It could lead to scholarship opportunities." My mother waved her hand dismissively. "Art scholarships are pennies compared to what your father and I can provide. Family comes first, Abigail. We're having our traditional pre-gala dinner at 6, and I expect both of you to be there dressed appropriately." That night, I sat on the edge of Emma's bed as she worked on her showcase piece, trying to find the words to tell her that once again, my mother's priorities would trump hers. "Grandma says we have to go to her boring dinner and gala," Emma said, before I could speak, her brush not pausing on the canvas. "I already know." "Emma, I'm so sorry. I'll talk to her again. Maybe we can compromise, attend dinner and then go to your showcase." Emma finally looked up at me, her blue eyes hard with a maturity no 15-year-old should have. "You always say you'll talk to her, Mom, but you never really do you?" Her words stung because they were true. For 15 years, I had been promising to protect her from my mother's controlling nature, but when push came to shove, I always capitulated, just as I had throughout my own childhood. That night, I lay awake wondering when exactly I had become my mother's echo instead of my daughter's advocate. I promised myself that somehow this time would be different. The morning of April 15th dawned bright and clear, with spring flowers blooming in my mother's meticulously maintained gardens. Emma was up early, carefully wrapping her showcase pieces for transport to school. "Ms. Reynolds said I should be there by 4 to help set up," she mentioned casually over breakfast, her eyes on her cereal rather than meeting mine. "The showcase starts at 7. I nodded, my stomach nodding as I thought of my mother's 6 o'clock dinner. "I'll figure something out, Emma, I promise." She gave me a look that said she'd heard that before and returned to her breakfast. Upstairs, my mother was already in full preparation mode. Her hairdresser was scheduled for noon, followed by her makeup artist at 3. The dining room table had been extended to its full length and covered with her finest damask tablecloth. The good china, the set that had belonged to her mother, was being carefully washed by Lucia, the housekeeper, who came in twice a week. "Abigail, there you are," my mother called when she spotted me passing the dining room. "The florist will be here at 2 with the centerpiece. Make sure Lucia knows to let him in. And remind your father that his tuxedo came back from the dry cleaners. It's hanging in our closet." "Mom, about tonight," I began, summoning my courage. Emma really needs to be at school by 4 for her showcase setup. Margaret was checking the silverware for water spots, holding each piece up to the light. She can drop off her paintings on the way to school this morning. There's no need for her to miss our family dinner. It's not just about dropping off the artwork. She's one of the featured students. The teachers are counting on her to help arrange the exhibition. My mother set down the fork she was inspecting and fixed me with the look that had cowed me since childhood. Abigail, this dinner before the gala is our family tradition. Your father and I are major donors to the hospital. The president of the board and his wife are joining us along with the new head of pediatric oncology. These connections could be valuable for Emma's future. But her showcase is a high school art show, my mother finished for me. There will be others. Family obligations come first. I'm sure her teachers will understand. Throughout the day, the house buzzed with preparations. Florists, caterers, and my mother's personal assistant came and went. Emma left for school with her artwork, her shoulders slumped in defeat when I couldn't promise her she could stay for setup. "I'll pick you up at 3:30, I said as she got out of the car. "We'll figure something out." She nodded without enthusiasm, gathering her portfolio of paintings. "Sure, Mom." During my lunch break at work, I called Ms. Reynolds hoping to explain the situation, but the conversation only made me feel worse. "Emma's work is exceptional, Mrs. Harper," the teacher said. "She's being considered for the Lansing Foundation Scholarship. The judges will be there tonight specifically to see her present her work." "Is there any way she could present earlier or later?" I asked desperately. "I'm afraid not. The schedule is set and Emma's presentation is at 7:30. Is there a problem?" I couldn't bring myself to say that my mother's dinner party was taking precedence over my daughter's future, so I mumbled something about a family commitment and promised Emma would be there somehow. When I picked her up from school, Emma was uncharacteristically quiet, staring out the window as we drove home. "Your teacher says you might win the Lansing Scholarship," I said, trying to sound upbeat. "Yeah. That's a big deal, Emma." She turned to look at me, her expression serious beyond her years. "It is. That's why I need to be there tonight." "I know. I'm working on it." Emma sighed. "You don't have to keep pretending, Mom. I know Grandma always wins." Her words hit me like a physical blow. Was that what I was teaching my daughter? That we should always surrender to the strongest personality in the room? That her dreams mattered less than keeping the peace? At home, the pre-gala dinner preparations were in full swing. The table looked like something out of a magazine, with crystal glasses catching the afternoon light and my mother's prized silver candelabra polished to a high shine. The caterers moved efficiently through the kitchen, preparing my mother's carefully selected menu. Emma retreated to her room while I found my mother in hers, being attended to by her makeup artist. "Mom, I need to talk to you about tonight," I said, standing in the doorway. "Can it wait? Dear Vivian is working on my eyes." "No, it can't. Emma's presentation at the showcase is at 7:30. She needs to be there. It's important for her future." My mother sighed, eyes closed, as the makeup artist applied eyeshadow. "We've already discussed this, Abigail. Dinner is at 6. The Richardsons and Dr. Patel will be here. Emma needs to understand the importance of family obligations." "Can't we compromise, attend part of dinner and leave in time for her presentation?" "That would be incredibly rude to our guests. Besides, your father is giving a toast before we leave for the gala. Emma should be present for that." "But Mom—" "Enough, Abigail," she said sharply. "I don't understand why you're encouraging this art obsession. Emma has so much potential. She could follow your father into finance or study medicine. These art shows are a distraction." I retreated, knowing I was getting nowhere. In the hallway, I ran into my father coming out of his study, already dressed in his tuxedo. "Dad, can you talk to Mom about tonight? Emma really needs to be at her art showcase." My father looked uncomfortable, adjusting his bow tie. "Your mother has been planning this dinner for months, Abigail. You know how important the gala is to her. And you know how important art is to Emma. Can't we find a middle ground?" He patted my shoulder awkwardly. "Let's just get through dinner smoothly. We can discuss Emma's art activities another time." I found Emma in her room, half-heartedly getting ready for dinner. She had put on the conservative navy blue dress my mother had bought her for such occasions, but her hair was still in the messy bun she wore for painting. "I talked to Grandma and Grandpa," I said, sitting on her bed. "And they're insisting on dinner at 6. Emma nodded, unsurprised. Lily texted that Ms. Reynolds is looking for me. They're starting setup now. I'm so sorry, Emma. Whatever. She turned back to her mirror, her expression closed off. I went to my own room to change into the formal dress my mother had deemed appropriate for the evening, a tasteful emerald green sheath that I knew cost more than a month of my salary. As I zipped it up, I caught sight of myself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back at me. When had I become this person who betrayed her own child to avoid conflict? At precisely 6 o'clock, we gathered in the dining room. My mother was resplendent in a silver evening gown, diamonds glittering at her neck and ears. My father stood stiffly by her side, already holding a glass of the expensive scotch he favored before social events. The Richardsons arrived first. Howard Richardson was the president of the hospital board, and his wife Elaine was my mother's closest social ally. Dr. Patel, newly appointed as head of pediatric oncology, arrived minutes later with his wife. You all know my daughter Abigail and my granddaughter Emma, my mother said smoothly as we took our seats. Emma is quite the student top of her class in mathematics and considering pre-med for college. I saw Emma's shoulders tense at the blatant lie, but she smiled politely as she'd been taught to do since she could walk. The first course was served a delicate asparagus soup that under normal circumstances I would have enjoyed, but every spoonful felt like torture as I watched Emma repeatedly glance at the ornate clock on the mantel. It was already 6:20. Conversation flowed around us, dominated by my mother and hospital gossip. Mrs. Richardson was describing her recent trip to Italy when I noticed Emma discreetly checking her phone under the table. Emma, my mother said sharply, phones are not appropriate at dinner. Please put that away. Sorry, Grandma, Emma murmured, slipping the phone into her dress pocket. A few minutes later, I felt my own phone vibrate in my clutch. I excused myself to use the restroom and checked it in the hallway. It was Lily, Emma's best friend, Ms. Reynolds, asking where Emma is. Setup almost done. Everyone asking about her paintings. Please come now. When I returned to the table, the main course was being served filet mignon with truffle butter and roasted vegetables arranged in an artistic pattern that would normally have impressed me, but now seemed like a cruel mockery of the art event we were missing. Emma's phone buzzed again, and she tried to check it discreetly, but my mother's eagle eye caught her. Emma, I've already asked you once about the phone, she said, her tone pleasant but with an edge that everyone at the table could hear. If you check it again, I'll have to take it from you until after dinner. It's important, Grandma, Emma said, a note of desperation in her voice. It's about my showcase, which you can attend another time, my mother replied smoothly. Now Dr. Patel was just telling us about the new pediatric wing. Isn't that fascinating? Emma's eyes filled with tears as she pushed her food around her plate. I felt physically ill, torn between my lifetime habit of appeasing my mother and my daughter's silent suffering. The minutes ticked by agonizingly slowly. 6:40, 6:50. Emma's phone kept buzzing in her pocket until finally my mother reached over and held out her hand. Give it to me, please. This is ridiculous. Grandma, please. Now, Emma. With shaking hands, Emma surrendered her phone. My mother placed it in her evening bag with a satisfied nod and returned to her story about last year's gala. At 7:15, Emma's composure finally broke. A tear slid down her cheek, followed by another. She tried to wipe them away discreetly, but Mrs. Richardson noticed. Is everything all right, dear? She asked, her voice kind but confused. Before Emma could answer, my phone rang loudly. I hadn't turned it to silent after checking Lily's message. My mother gave me a withering look as I fumbled to silence it, but not before I saw it was Ms. Reynolds calling. Excuse me, I said, standing up. I need to take this. It's Emma's teacher. Abigail, we are in the middle of dinner, my mother said, her smile fixed but her eyes furious. It'll just take a moment. I stepped into the hallway and answered the call. Mrs. Harper, where are you and Emma? The showcase has started and the Lansing Foundation judges are specifically asking to meet her. They've already seen her work and are extremely impressed. We're having a family dinner, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I understand family commitments, but Mrs. Harper, they're announcing the scholarship winners at 8. Emma is the frontrunner for the top prize $20,000 and mentorship with professional artists. This could change her life. The phone nearly slipped from my suddenly numb fingers. $20,000. Yes, and more importantly, recognition that could open doors to any art program in the country. Please get her here if you possibly can. I hung up and stood frozen in the hallway, the weight of what was happening finally hitting me full force. My mother was sacrificing my daughter's future for a dinner party, and I was letting her. I walked back into the dining room where dessert was now being served, my mother's signature crème brûlée. Emma sat with her head down, no longer even pretending to participate in the conversation. "Who was on the phone, dear?" My mother asked, her tone making it clear that whatever it was couldn't possibly be as important as her dinner. That's when something inside me finally snapped. "Emma has been selected for a $20,000 art scholarship," I said, my voice ringing out clearly in the suddenly quiet dining room. "The judges are waiting to meet her. We need to leave. Now." My mother's face flushed with anger. "Abigail, we are in the middle of dessert. The gala starts in less than an hour. You can't possibly—" "Yes, I can." I interrupted something I had never dared to do before. "And I am. Emma, get your things. We're going to your showcase." Emma looked up, hope and disbelief warring on her face. "Really? Really?" My mother set her dessert spoon down with exaggerated care. "If you walk out that door, Abigail, there will be consequences. Think very carefully about what you're doing." The threat hung in the air, heavy with implications. Without my parents' financial support, Emma might have to leave her private school. We might have to move out of the comfortable guest house on their property. I might have to find a second job or take out loans. But looking at my daughter's tear-streaked face, I knew none of that mattered compared to what was at stake. "I'm sorry," I said to the guests who were watching the drama unfold with uncomfortable expressions. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for my daughter, and we need to leave." To my utter shock, my father stood up as well. In 40 years of marriage, I had never seen him directly contradict my mother. "I'd like to see Emma's artwork too," he said quietly. "Margaret, perhaps we could finish dessert quickly and all go together." My mother's face went from flushed to pale. "William, the gala will still be there if we're a bit late," he finished for her. "Our granddaughter's achievement seems worth celebrating." Emma had already jumped to her feet, hope transforming her face. "We need to hurry. The judges are there now." "Sit down, all of you," my mother hissed, mortification clear in her expression. "We have guests." "Actually, Doctor," Patel said, dabbing his mouth with his napkin, "I'm quite interested in seeing young talent. The hospital is looking to commission artwork for the new pediatric wing, you know." Mrs. Richardson nodded. "Howard and I would be delighted to see Emma's work before heading to the gala." My mother was cornered, but she wasn't going down without a fight. "This is absurd. Emma's little paintings can wait. We have commitments." "No, Mother," I said firmly. "You have commitments. Emma and I have our own priorities now." I turned to our guests. "Please enjoy your dessert. We need to go." Emma was already running for the door. I followed, grabbing my car keys from the silver dish in the foyer, where my mother insisted they be kept out of sight. "Abigail," my mother's voice rang out behind me. "If you leave now, don't expect us to continue paying Emma's tuition, or to subsidize your inadequate salary, or to put a roof over your heads." I turned back to face her, seeing her clearly, perhaps for the first time in my life, not as the intimidating force who had shaped my every decision, but as a frightened woman whose control was slipping. "That's your choice to make, Mother, just like this is mine." Emma was already in my car when I got outside. To my surprise, my father came hurrying down the front steps behind me. "I'm coming too," he said, climbing into the back seat before I could object. The drive to the school was tense, with Emma checking the time every 30 seconds. "It's 7:25, she moaned. "My presentation is in 5 minutes." "We'll make it," I promised, driving faster than I ever had before. "The school is only 10 minutes away." "Your mother will come around," my father said suddenly from the back seat. "She always does eventually." I caught his eye in the rearview mirror. "Not this time, Dad. I think I finally crossed a line she won't forgive." "Then perhaps it was a line that needed crossing," he said softly. "I should have helped you do it years ago." We pulled into the school parking lot at 7:32. Emma bolted from the car before I'd fully stopped running toward the arts building. My father and I followed more slowly. The exhibition hall was packed with students, parents, teachers, and what appeared to be professional artists and gallery owners based on their sophisticated attire. Emma's work had been given a prominent position near the center of the hall, 5 large canvases arranged in a powerful sequence. I stopped in my tracks when I saw them properly for the first time. The paintings were stunning, a series depicting a young woman breaking free from various constraints. In the first, she was bound by golden chains in an opulent room. In the second, the chains were beginning to crack. By the fifth, she stood free under an open sky. The broken chains at her feet transformed into stepping stones leading toward a horizon bright with possibility. The technical skill was impressive, but it was the emotion in each piece that took my breath away. And I wasn't the only one affected. A small crowd had gathered around Emma's display, where she was now speaking animatedly to an older woman with a judge badge and several other distinguished-looking visitors. "Did you know she could paint like this?" my father asked, his voice hushed with awe. "I knew she was talented, but this—" I shook my head, overwhelmed with pride and shame in equal measure. Pride in my daughter's extraordinary gift, and shame that I had nearly prevented her from sharing it. Ms. Reynolds spotted us and came over beaming. "You made it." The judges are extremely impressed. The head of the foundation specifically mentioned the maturity of Emma's theme and execution. "Will she still be considered for the scholarship even though she missed the beginning?" I asked anxiously. "Absolutely. In fact, I think she's the frontrunner." Ms. Reynolds lowered her voice. "Between us, I've never seen the judges spend this much time with a student artist before. It's a very good sign." Over the next half hour, we moved through the exhibition, admiring the other students' work while keeping an eye on Emma, who was now surrounded by adults handing her business cards and shaking her hand. My father seemed genuinely interested in the artwork, asking thoughtful questions about techniques and materials that surprised me. At precisely 8 o'clock, the principal called for everyone's attention and announced the scholarship winners. When Emma's name was called for the top prize, the room erupted in applause. I found myself crying unashamedly as my daughter accepted a certificate and posed for photos with the foundation directors. "She reminds me of you," my father said unexpectedly, handing me a tissue from his pocket. "You used to draw all the time as a child. Do you remember?" I did remember vaguely colorful pictures that my mother had discouraged because they made a mess and took time away from more valuable pursuits, like piano and French. "I never knew you noticed," I said. "I noticed a lot of things," he replied quietly. "I just didn't say anything. That was my mistake." We were still talking when I spotted a familiar silver evening gown by the entrance. My mother stood stiffly scanning the room until her eyes found us. Slowly, she made her way through the crowd, her expression unreadable. "You left your guests," I said when she reached us, unsure what else to say. "They understood the situation and went ahead to the gala." She looked past me to where Emma was still surrounded by admirers. "I see she won something." "The top scholarship," my father said, a note of pride in his voice. $20,000 and a mentorship program. My mother's eyes widened slightly. She had always respected monetary value above all else. "That's significant." "Yes, it is," I agreed. "And it's just the beginning for her." We stood awkwardly until Emma noticed her grandmother and excused herself from her conversation to join us. "You came," she said to my mother, surprise evident in her voice. "I wanted to see what all the fuss was about." My mother gestured toward the paintings. "You did these?" Emma nodded. "Do you like them?" A loaded question if ever there was one. My mother studied the canvases for a long moment. "They show considerable technical skill," she finally said, which from her was high praise indeed. Emma seemed to understand that was the best she would get. "The director of the foundation wants to meet you all. They're having a small reception for the winners and their families." My mother checked her diamond watch. "We really should make an appearance at the gala." "This is Emma's night," I said firmly. "The gala will have to wait." I expected another argument, but to my surprise, my mother merely nodded. "Very well. A short appearance at the reception, and then the gala." As we followed Emma to the adjoining room where refreshments were being served, my mother leaned close to me. We'll discuss your living arrangements tomorrow, she whispered. I meant what I said about consequences, Abigail. I met her gaze steadily. I know you did, Mother. And I meant what I said too. Emma and I will manage whatever you decide. For the first time in my memory, it was my mother who looked away first. The next week was one of the most difficult of my life. True to her word, my mother informed us that we would need to find our own housing and that Emma's tuition payments would cease at the end of the semester. My father tried to intervene, but for once my mother was unmovable. Actions have consequences, she said during an icy Sunday lunch. Abigail made her choice. Emma and I spent evenings scouring rental listings looking for something we could afford on my administrative assistant's salary. The options were depressingly limited, mostly tiny one-bedroom apartments in neighborhoods far from Emma's school. Maybe I could transfer to public school next year, Emma suggested as we drove home from viewing a particularly depressing basement apartment. Then we could afford something better. The fact that my 15-year-old daughter was making such sacrifices to accommodate our new reality broke my heart. Let's see what happens with the scholarship first, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. And I'm going to look for a better-paying job. That turned out to be easier said than done. I had been with the insurance company for nearly 10 years, but my skills were specialized to their systems, and my degree in communications was over a decade old. Interview after interview ended with polite rejections. By the end of the month, we had to make a decision. I signed a lease on a small 2-bedroom apartment across town. It wasn't in the best neighborhood, but it was clean and had a tiny balcony where Emma could set up an easel. Moving day was surreal. All our lives we had lived surrounded by my parents' expensive furniture and art. Now we were forced to confront how little we actually owned ourselves. My bedroom furniture had been purchased by my parents. Most of Emma's clothing had been gifts from my mother. Even the silverware we ate with belonged to the main house. We packed what was truly ours into a rented truck, my clothes, Emma's art supplies, some books, personal mementos, and a few pieces of furniture I had purchased with my own money over the years. It filled less than half the truck. As we were loading the last boxes, my father appeared from the main house carrying a large envelope. "Some things you might need," he said, pressing it into my hands before giving me an awkward hug. "Your mother doesn't know." Inside, I found cash $5,000 and a note with the name and number of a friend of his who owned an art gallery in town. "For emergencies," the note read, "and opportunities." Emma cried when we first entered our new apartment. After the spaciousness of my parents' guest house, it felt cramped and shabby. The walls were a dingy off-white, the carpet was worn, and the kitchen appliances were at least 20 years old. "I'm so sorry," I said, sitting next to her on the floor since we hadn't yet assembled our second-hand sofa. "I know it's not what you're used to." She wiped her eyes and looked around. "Can I paint the walls? Grandma never let me change anything." "You can paint them any color you want," I promised. That weekend, we bought inexpensive paint and transformed the apartment. Emma chose a vibrant blue for her bedroom and a sunny yellow for the living room. We found colorful throw pillows at a thrift store and hung Emma's artwork on every wall. It wasn't luxurious, but for the first time it felt like ours. Money was tight, almost suffocatingly so. I took on evening shifts at a local cafe to supplement my day job. Emma found weekend work babysitting for families in our old neighborhood. We learned to budget strictly shop sales and appreciate small luxuries like a rented movie and homemade popcorn on Friday nights. The hardest part was Emma's school. Without my parents' tuition payments, she would have to leave Westfield Academy at the end of the semester. Ms. Reynolds was devastated when we told her. "Emma has such potential," she said during a meeting in her classroom. "There must be something we can do." "Unless the school offers significant financial aid, I'm afraid we're out of options," I explained. "My salary barely covers our rent and food." Ms. Reynolds tapped her pen thoughtfully. "What are you doing now, Abigail, for work, I mean?" "I'm an administrative assistant at Hartford Insurance plus evening shifts at Cafe Luna." She jotted something down on a notepad. "The reason I ask is that I have a friend who runs the Franklin Gallery downtown. They're looking for someone with administrative skills who also has knowledge of art. The pay is better than what you're probably making now, and the hours would be more flexible." "I don't know anything about gallery administration," I said doubtfully. But you know about art, I can see that in how you talk about Emma's work. And you clearly have organizational skills. She tore off the paper and handed it to me. Just talk to Sarah. Tell her I sent you. To my surprise, Sarah Michaels, the gallery owner, hired me on the spot. We need someone who can handle the business side but also speak intelligently to clients about the art, she explained. Diana says you have both skills, plus you're reliable. That's a rare combination. The job paid nearly double what I was making at the insurance company, with the added benefit of regular hours. For the first time since leaving my parents' home, I could breathe a little easier financially. Working at the gallery opened up a new world for me. Surrounded by beautiful art every day, I found myself sketching during lunch breaks, tentative drawings at first, then more confident ones. Sarah noticed and encouraged me, even setting up a small workspace in the gallery's back office where I could paint after hours. You have talent, she told me after seeing my first completed canvas in over 20 years. It runs in the family, I guess. The scholarship money from Emma's award went directly toward her tuition, allowing her to stay at Westfield Academy. The mentorship program connected her with professional artists who further developed her techniques and introduced her to gallery owners and art school representatives. My father visited us occasionally always when my mother was occupied elsewhere. He brought small housewarming gifts, a potted plant, a set of wine glass, a framed photo of Emma as a toddler. He never stayed long, but each visit seemed to ease something in him, as if he too were slowly breaking free from my mother's rigid expectations. Your mother asks about you, he mentioned during one visit. She doesn't say it directly, but I know she wonders how you're managing. We're doing fine, I told him, and realized it was true. We were more than fine. We were thriving in our own way. 6 months after moving out, Emma came home from school bubbling with excitement. Ms. Reynolds wants to know if we'd participate in the faculty student exhibition next month. Both of us. Mom. She's seen your paintings at the gallery and thinks they're amazing. I was stunned. My paintings? But I'm just a beginner again. Ms. Reynolds says your work shows raw emotional authenticity and would complement my technical approach. Emma grinned. That's fancy art talk for your mom's paintings have feelings. The idea was terrifying and exhilarating. I hadn't shown my art to anyone except Sarah, Emma, and a few gallery employees. The thought of displaying it publicly made my stomach knot with anxiety. What would people think? What would my mother say if she heard about it? But looking at Emma's excited face, I couldn't say no. Okay, I agreed. Let's do it. We spent the next few weeks preparing our pieces, Emma working on a new series about transformation, me completing a collection I had tentatively titled Second Chances. The night before the exhibition, Emma helped me frame my paintings, her touch gentle as she handled my work with the same care I had always shown hers. Are you nervous? She asked as we carefully wrapped them for transport. Terrified, I admitted, but also kind of excited. I never thought I'd do anything like this. She hugged me impulsively. I'm so proud of you, Mom. I blinked back tears, overwhelmed by the role reversal, my daughter proud of me, rather than the other way around. When had my little girl become so wise and strong? The faculty student exhibition was held in the school's main gallery, a beautiful space usually reserved for professional shows. Our work was displayed side by side, Emma's technically brilliant, emotionally evocative paintings beside my more primitive but heartfelt efforts. To my amazement, people actually stopped to look at mine, sometimes standing before them for long minutes, their expressions thoughtful. Abigail Harper, a woman's voice said behind me. I'm Julia Westfield, head of the arts department. I turned to shake her hand, suddenly conscious of my simple dress and lack of expensive jewelry things that had never bothered me at gallery events before, but now seemed glaring in this environment where I had always felt judged. Your work is fascinating, she continued. Diana Reynolds tells me you've only recently returned to painting after a long hiatus. Yes, since childhood, really. Well, you've retained an authenticity that many trained artists struggle to achieve. There's something very compelling about your use of color and space. She handed me her card. We're always looking for instructors for our community art program, teaching adults who want to explore art for personal enrichment. Would you be interested? I stared at the card, speechless. But I don't have any formal training or credentials. Sometimes that's an advantage when working with beginners. They find it less intimidating. She smiled. Think about it and give me a call. Throughout the evening, people approached me to discuss my work. Some were parents I had known peripherally during Emma's school years, but who had always seen me as merely Margaret Harper's daughter or Emma's mother. Now they spoke to me as an individual with something unique to offer. I was speaking with a group of art students when I felt a shift in the atmosphere around me. Looking up, I saw my mother standing across the gallery studying one of my paintings. My father stood beside her, his expression encouraging as he whispered something in her ear. My heart raced as they made their way toward us. I hadn't seen my mother in nearly 7 months, though my father had kept us informed about her activities. She looked thinner, I thought, and there were new lines around her eyes. Abigail, she said formally, as if we were acquaintances rather than mother and daughter. Your father insisted we attend. I'm glad you came, I replied, meaning it despite my anxiety. Emma will be happy to see you. My mother nodded stiffly. Her work has improved considerably. The instruction at this school has clearly been beneficial. Coming from her, it was effusive praise. I waited, wondering if she would mention my paintings, but she remained silent on the subject. And what do you think of Mom's paintings, Grandma? Emma asked, appearing suddenly at my side. Aren't they amazing? My mother's gaze flickered to the canvas nearest us, a painting of a woman stepping out of shadows into sunlight. They're expressive, she finally said. I didn't realize you had returned to art, Abigail. It's been healing for me, I said simply. Something passed across my mother's face, a fleeting expression I couldn't quite identify. Regret, envy, confusion. Whatever it was quickly replaced by her usual composed mask. The gallery where I work is having an opening next Friday, I found myself saying. Some local artists and a few from New York. You and Dad would be welcome to attend. My mother seemed startled by the invitation. We'll have to check our calendar. The spring social season is quite busy. Of course, no pressure. I was surprised to realize I meant it. Her approval, once so desperately important to me, now seemed like just one opinion among many valued but no longer defining. As they moved away to view the rest of the exhibition, my father lingered behind. This is good what you're doing, he said quietly. Both of you. She'll come around in her own way. I know, Dad, but it's okay if she doesn't too. We're doing just fine. 1 year after Emma's art showcase that changed everything, our lives had transformed in ways I never could have imagined. I now worked full-time at the Franklin Gallery as assistant director with responsibilities that included curating exhibitions and working directly with artists. On weekends, I taught art classes at Westfield Academy's community program classes that had unexpectedly become so popular, there was now a waiting list. Emma was preparing for her senior year, with acceptance letters from 3 prestigious art schools, all offering substantial scholarships based on her portfolio, and the recommendations of her mentors from the Lansing Foundation. Our apartment, once so stark and disappointing, had become a true home. We had gradually replaced the second-hand furniture with pieces we loved, often found at flea markets, and refinished together. The walls were covered with art, some purchased from local artists we had befriended, some created by Emma and me. It wasn't large or luxurious, but every inch of it reflected our tastes and personalities in a way my parents' perfect home never had. My relationship with my mother had evolved into something I would describe as a cautious truce. After months of minimal contact, she had finally accepted one of my invitations to a gallery opening. To my surprise, she had actually engaged with the artists, asking thoughtful questions about their work. Since then, she had attended several exhibitions, always formal and somewhat reserved, but making an effort that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Emma had forgiven her grandmother more easily than I had, recognizing that in her own rigid way, my mother had always believed she was doing what was best for us. They had developed a relationship independent of me with my mother, occasionally taking Emma to lunch or to art museums in the city. My father had blossomed in unexpected ways once freed from always siding with my mother. He had reduced his work hours and taken up photography, revealing a creative side I had never known existed. He often visited our apartment bringing groceries or small gifts, and had become a regular at Emma's school events. On the anniversary of our move, I invited my parents to dinner at our apartment, something that would have been unthinkable in our previous dynamic. To my surprise, my mother accepted. I spent the day preparing not an elaborate meal like my mother would have served, but simple, flavorful food I knew everyone would enjoy: roasted chicken, fresh vegetables from the farmer's market, and a homemade apple pie. Emma set the table with the mismatched china we had collected from thrift stores, pieces chosen for their beauty rather than their pedigree, and arranged fresh flowers in the center. "Do you think Grandma will be okay with our apartment now?" she asked as we put the finishing touches on the table. "She seemed pretty shocked the first time she visited." I laughed, remembering my mother's barely concealed horror at our bohemian decor and modest space. "She's learning to adapt. We all are." My parents arrived precisely on time, my mother carrying a bottle of wine much more expensive than what we usually drank, my father with a small wrapped package. "For the apartment," he explained, handing it to me. Inside was a photograph he had taken, a beautiful black and white image of Emma and me at her school exhibition, both of us laughing at something outside the frame. He had framed it himself, he explained proudly, in a woodworking class he was taking. "It's perfect, Dad," I said, hugging him. My mother examined our apartment with a critical eye that once would have devastated me, but now merely amused me. "You've done interesting things with the space," she said cautiously. "Thanks, Mom. We like it." Dinner was surprisingly pleasant. Emma shared her plans for art school. My father talked about his photography class, and even my mother contributed stories about her volunteer work at the hospital, a role she had taken on with typical intensity after stepping back from the social committee. After dessert, Emma excused herself to meet friends, leaving me alone with my parents. An awkward silence fell until my mother surprised me by saying, "I found something recently when I was reorganizing your father's study." She opened her handbag and removed a small leather portfolio. These were in the back of a drawer. Inside were drawings, my drawings from when I was perhaps 10 or 11 years old. Horses, fairies, landscapes, all drawn with the enthusiasm and imperfect skill of a child who loved creating. "You kept these?" I asked my father, amazed. He nodded. "You used to bring them to me in my study. I saved them all." "I never knew," I said softly, touching the faded papers. "There are more," my mother said. "Boxes of them in the attic. From both of you." She hesitated. "I didn't throw anything away, Abigail. I just put them where they wouldn't make a mess." Coming from my mother, it was as close to an apology as I was likely to get. "Thank you for finding these," I said. "They mean a lot to me." She nodded, then squared her shoulders as if preparing for something difficult. "Your father and I have been talking. We'd like to establish a trust for Emma's education. No strings attached," she added quickly. "The money would be hers to use for whatever program she chooses." I was stunned. "Mom, that's incredibly generous, but we're doing okay. The scholarships will cover most of her expenses." "I know. This isn't about need. It's about—" She faltered, searching for words that didn't come easily to her. "It's about supporting her dreams, even if they're not what I would have chosen." My father reached over and squeezed her hand encouragingly. It was perhaps the first spontaneous gesture of affection I'd seen between them in years. "We'd like to do the same for you," he said. "A fund for you to pursue your art education if you want, or to travel to museums. Whatever would help you develop your talent." I don't know what to say, I admitted, overwhelmed by this unexpected generosity. "Say yes," my father suggested with a smile. "Yes. Thank you. Both of you." After my parents left, I sat in our quiet apartment, thinking about the strange journey that had brought us to this point. A year ago, I had been afraid of losing everything my parents support: Emma's education, our comfortable lifestyle. In the end, I had lost those things, at least temporarily, but gained something far more valuable: the courage to build a life based on authenticity rather than appearances. That night, I pulled out a blank canvas and began painting. The image that emerged was of three women, grandmother, mother, and daughter, each with her own distinct style and path, yet connected by invisible threads of love and shared history. It wasn't perfect. The proportions were slightly off, the perspective not quite right. But it was true, and that made it beautiful. Looking at the finished painting in the soft light of dawn, I realized that this was the real luxury my mother had never understood: the freedom to be imperfectly, authentically yourself, surrounded by people who love you exactly as you are. Where would your story of breaking free begin? Have you ever had to choose between pleasing others and being true to yourself or someone you love? Share your experiences in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about finding the courage to create your own path. Remember, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply say no to others' expectations and yes to your own heart. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Until next time, be brave, be authentic, and be kind to yourself.